Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Entity Framework Core Community Stand-Up. Thanks everyone for joining us. Today, we have a deep dive into migrations. Before we get started, we're going to look at a few community links, and I'm going to go around and introduce the team. My name is Jeremy Lickness. I'm a program manager for .NET Data, and today we have with us Arthur.
Hi, I'm Arthur. I'm the engineering manager for Entity Framework.
And we have Bryce.
Howdy, I'm Bryce. I'm an engineer on Entity Framework, and I work on migrations.
Working on migrations. I heard you have one or two things to show us today.
Yeah, hopefully they're interesting.
Awesome. Well, let's take a look at some links that came out previously. Let me get the stream set up here. There we go. Nice set of links. So the first thing is an announcement from Oracle, and they have finally released to production, very exciting milestone, the Oracle provider for Entity Framework Core 3.1. So if you're an Oracle developer, you now have a production provider to connect to Oracle from Entity Framework Core 3.1. Any thoughts or comments from the team?
So this is great to see. I'll say that as I think most people are aware, the upgrade from 2x to 3x was pretty difficult for providers, which may explain why this is a little bit later than some of the other providers. But it should be easier going from 3.1 to 5. So now this is out there. Hopefully they'll be able to get working on a 5.0 provider pretty soon.
Awesome. Our next link. This was a fun link and a fun read. Playing with Entity Framework Core 5 and Stack Overflow data. So the relevant things around this post are that they worked with a pretty large data set that's available for anyone to pull down. I think it was like 18 gigabytes that they ended up with.
And I think that's actually even one of the smaller data sets.
Okay. One of the smaller data sets, they pulled it in, they scaffolded, they ran code, published a repository. Pretty cool post.
So what I meant was the 18 gigabyte one that they use is actually one of the smaller data sets that Stack Exchange has. So I wasn't aware of this before. This is really cool stuff, and really cool to have this data available for Stack Exchange for doing some testing over bigger sizes of data than most of our sample applications have.
Yeah, I'm excited to see people just working with Entity Framework Core. Of course, we'll talk about that in a second, but our release candidate is out, and we definitely want people to jump on this and start giving us feedback. But before we get to that, I want to share this blog post, seeding data in Entity Framework Core using SQL scripts. Let me add Shai just joined us. Hello, Shai. Welcome to the show. So this is another way of seeding data in Entity Framework Core, and I don't know if Bryce is going to talk about seeding data as part of the migrations or not, but there's a few different approaches. If you're familiar with Entity Framework, you can seed through code, you can seed through database, you can do it completely out of band and not use Entity Framework, and this is focused specifically on the SQL script approach.
I will not be covering seed data today.
Okay. Well, there's a blog post to do that. And here's the big announcement. Release candidate 1. I feel like we should have like a bullhorn and some confetti to throw. But this is a massive release. If you take a look at the post and just scroll through the features that are in this, the feature list is pretty impressive, and it's cumulative, right, from all of the previous releases. So this is one that has a go live license. You're allowed to run it in production. It is considered stable, but it is our chance to address any critical issues that come up from anyone using this between now and when the final release comes out. I don't know if anyone has other thoughts or comments on the RC1 release.
So, I mean, just to add to what Jeremy said, this is feature complete. We're not adding anything more by design. So if you test it on here and it doesn't work, then it isn't going to work when we release it. So if you test it on here and let us know, we may be able to fix the bug or something else before we release. That's unlikely to be add new features, but we've put a lot of stuff in EFCore 5, and there are going to be bugs that we just don't know about. That's the reality, even though we have 70,000 tests, that's the reality of a fairly complex product with lots of interactions. So the more we get testing on RC1, the more we can fix those before we even go RTM, which I think will benefit everyone. So really encourage you to get the RC1 supported on Go Live. You don't need a daily build feed. So go for it. And with regard to the features, we list the RC1 features in the blog post, but there's a link also in the blog post to our documentation where we have an overview of all of the features for all of the different previews that are going in, that will be in the final release. So take a look at that too.
Awesome news. And then my last link, I'm not going to spend too much time on because it ties directly into what Bryce is about to cover, but I added the link to the migrations overview in our documentation. But without further ado, because the focus of this episode is migrations, I'm going to turn things over to Bryce.
All right. I guess we should probably start by saying, what are migrations? I know hopefully we get a lot of new viewers, or viewers new to EF on this show. So migrations are a way of bringing your database schema to match your domain model. And so a migration is sort of the steps that your database needs to take in order to become in sync with your model that you use for your application. I'm going to start sharing here. And I have here a pretty interesting, a pretty interesting app. I wanted to throw something together that was interesting. It's not just a console app, it's a console app with generic host. So we're really stepping up our game here. And so if you're not familiar with generic host, it's basically like the ASP.NET application model without an HTTP server running. So it gives you this default host builder, which gives you things like logging and configuration and a service container. And so here, and then I'm adding a little worker in here. My worker really doesn't do anything right now. Every day it goes and kicks off this execute task. This execute task creates a service scope, which is similar to what ASP.NET does for a request. And then I go ahead and get my DB context out of there and I do something interesting, or at least it will eventually, The focus today isn't on the application though, it's on the migrations. So if we go back to program, where I add my DB context, first I'm getting the configuration and I'm looking at this provider option here. And then based on that provider option, I'm actually configuring my DB context to use a completely different database provider. So if it's SQLite, I'm going to use SQLite. I'm going to use the SQLite connection in my config. And I'm going to, if it's SQL Server, I'm going to use SQL Server with a SQL Server connection. There's also this interesting thing here, this migrations assembly. I have one migrations assembly for SQLite and another migrations assembly for SQL Server. We call these things migration sets. And here I have two sets, one for SQL Server and one for SQLite. But you can imagine you have one set for day-to-day development and maybe another set for like release to release in production. And so that way, when you migrate production, you don't have to go through every little step it took you to get there during development. You can have a much more streamlined V1 to V2 to V3 sort of thing. So let's look at how these migrations assemblies work. Over here, I have two assemblies. We'll look at the SQL Server one. All it is a .NET 5 class library, and it references my main project. It has to reference the DB context. If I had another layer in between here, I could have my app reference the data layer, and then this thing would reference the data layer. And then in order for this to work at design time, we need to be able to load it from our startup project. And since we can't put a reference back to this assembly from worker service, that would create a circular reference. Instead, I'm just simply using the output directory. So whenever I build this assembly, it'll just go next to my main application, and my main application doesn't have to reference it. Again, if I had a data layer, I could actually add a reference to here because there's a inversion of control, right? There's one more level that it can go through, and I could add a reference. So I've seen people struggling with this in the past, so I really wanted to show this is a cheap way to get little migration sets. One of the benefits of having these in a separate assembly is that you don't have to deploy them with your application. A lot of people use migrations simply as a deployment artifact. And then once your app is running, we hope that you never have to call migrate, because once you've published, your schema should be up to date. That's not always true. I mean, I can imagine a Xamarin app where whenever it downloads a new version, you need to migrate whatever version they were on before. It could have been 2 versions ago. It could have been the last version. And so that is a case where you would want to deploy them. But in this case, they just live separately.
So we
Bryce,
have go ahead.
I was going to say we have a question. I think you were on the same page as me. So the question is, can we have a shared migration lib and a specific one, or should we duplicate everything in both libraries?
That depends. You can't, so another thing, if I go back to the program, this is the exact same DB context, using all the same domain classes and everything. Even the on model creating is the same here. And so you can't have 2 sets of migrations pointing to the same DB context in the same assembly. I could, however, have one set here in the main application and then another set outside in a different project, if that answers the question.
So Bryce, so you're showing, it seems like there's multiple reasons here for doing the 2 different sets of migrations, right? So we have in this case, we want to do SQLite and SQL Server. So can you talk a little bit about why we can't have one migration set just for every, SQLite and SQL Server all combined, and why it makes sense to separate them out by provider?
Yeah, so let me actually start digging into, I don't know, maybe, So the model is actually different between these 2 things. So on SQL Server, for example, your primary key columns typically have identity. And there's not really the same thing in SQLite. There's this auto increment idea, but it really doesn't match to SQL Server's version of identity. And so a lot of the facets and the data types, right? SQLite has text, SQL Server uses and varchar, And so on the surface, the models look the same, and at the programming model, it's all kind of the same. But by the time you get down to the details of the database, it gets pretty different. And so if you were diffing your SQLite model against your SQL Server model, you would actually get differences, and it could really start to confuse migrations. And so we really discourage you from trying to create a single set of migrations for multiple providers unless you really know what you're doing. But even then, it's just easier not to do that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
All right, let's dig into the model a little bit. It's not very original. I mean, as with most EF samples, it's blogs and posts. We're living in the 90s or whatever. We love blogs. So I have a simple blog class, has the URI source. I don't know if many people know this, but you can actually use URI in your entity types, and it will automatically get converted to a string. As a title, a blog has many posts. I have a person here who has a name and an email address, and then the posts that they have authored. Here's the post. It points to a blog. The blog that it belongs to has a title, has a content, and the person who authored that post. And then I have a subtype of post here. This is for a podcast or like a vlog or something. They have a media attached to each post, a video or audio sample or whatever, and then the URI to that thing. And then my DB context is pretty straightforward. I just have DB sets for these things. I reference my derived types so they get included in the model. And then I have, just for fun here, actually, I'll show you why I have this in a minute. I have an index over email for the people to make sure they're unique, just so we don't add the same person twice. Seemed like a good idea at the time.
It is a good idea. Believe me, with the ASP.NET Identity, there used to be an option to, well, there still is an option to not have independent emails, and people migrating from that to, oh, we want you to have a unique email is a major pain. So yeah, go with unique from the beginning. That's what I say.
Speaking of identity, there is a new feature in 5.0 that lets you exclude an entity type from a DB context. And this is called, what are they called? My mind just went blank.
Bounded context.
Bounded context, yeah. So the idea here is that you have one large domain model that has everything. It has your blogs and posts. It has your users with all their profile settings. I don't know, it has your paying customers and their billing details or whatever. And so the idea is you kind of draw boundaries around the different parts of the app. So one part of the app is all about blogging, and it just has to worry about blogs. It's in charge of defining what a blog is and how to insert and update a blog. And then maybe another DB context is all about identity, and you need to keep track of users and their passwords and their profile settings and stuff like that. The problem with that is there's often overlap. For example, a user posts a blog post, and so there's kind of these foreign keys going between these two things. But the blogging context shouldn't really define what a user is. It just happens to be referencing one, so it can do auditing or show their avatar with their username in the when it's displaying a post. And so in the blogging context, you would actually want to exclude the user from migrations because it's not really the responsibility of that context. And so finally, a lot of people have been asking this for a while. So in this example, we could exclude the person by calling toTable people, and then for that table, we want to exclude it from migrations. And so now whenever you add migrations to this context, it would completely ignore the person entity. All the foreign keys would still be there, of course, and you could add and remove foreign keys to the users. But it really kind of separates that boundary between this is the blogging context responsibility and this is the identity context responsibility.
Yeah, that's awesome.
About that.
We have question slightly related, which is when about the ordering of inherited base classes, the properties inherited base class. The base class properties are created first, and then derived class properties are afterwards. Can I order the base class properties?
Sure. The easiest way to order them is to go into the migration. So here's the initial create. Oh, I'll actually do the SQL Server one. Right here, and we have, where is that? That's the post table. So if I wanted media URL to be up above, just move these around. Like this is the order that the table will be created in. You can do it in whatever order you want. And that's after you add a migration in the create table statement. That's the simplest way to order tables.
So the important thing to remember about the column orders in tables is they don't change if you then add another migration. We don't automatically move columns around. And that's because it requires a table rebuild to change the column orders. So if you really think you need to change your column orders after you've created a table because it's that important, then you're going to have to rebuild that table with the different column order. And that isn't something that we are planning to automatically do in EFCore 5 or actually in a future release. So we get a lot of questions about column orders, but the reality is you're kind of stuck with column orders effectively once you've created your table. So having EF order them doesn't have that much value over doing what Bryce just did. And when I'm creating the table, to go in and I'll do a one-time, order of the columns then.
And we try to be helpful in the order. We group things together by entity type. We put the primary keys first. We try and have a good default, but everyone's going to want something different.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so really just order them in the create table statement. And ideally, like if you have a tool that can display things based on some metadata somewhere, that would be even better. Then you don't have to worry about what the physical on disk order is.
Yep.
Alrighty, so let's start making changes to our model here. I read up on GDPR, and apparently I should not be storing people's email addresses at all. I'm just kidding. I'm grasping at straws for these examples. So I'm going to remove the email address from person. I also had that unique index. I'm going to go ahead and remove that here.
Oh no! Don't do it.
Don't need the unique index. All right. So to add a migration, same as ever. Add migration. Remove person email. I like to use these like commit messages. Just tell you what I did. It's going to go through, build the solution. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? It's going to tell me what I forgot to do. It says my migrations assembly doesn't match the one I'm expecting. So I'm here on worker service. I want to add these to SQL Server migrations. It really helps you keep your migration sets straight. All right, an operation with data loss. Uh-oh, that's okay. We deleted a column. We're fully expecting that. And there it is, dropping an index, dropping the column. So pretty simple. Let's go and look at, so now that I've done that, I want to show you something new here. So we've always had this .NET, and forgive me for using .NET EF here in the package manager console, but it's just easy. .NET EF migrations list. We've had this for a while. Oh, and I need to specify which project I'm using, SQL Server migrations, and which startup project I'm using, worker service. We've had this command for a while, and it goes through and it lists all the migrations that it knows about. The thing that's new here, which didn't seem to work, let me build my project because the .NET EF, oh, it should automatically do that.
Should say it's pending.
And it should say this new migration is pending, but it didn't even show the new migration. Let's build.
Maybe we have a bug.
Maybe we do.
We appreciate your contribution to the RC candidate.
I should have showed the package manager. Oh, wow, it's not working at all. What did I do wrong?
I don't know. It worked for me. I tried it before I did the release notes. So,
all right. Well, here, let's try get migration and see if it works. There we go. That works. I have no idea what I did wrong. That is weird. I probably typed something wrong. So anyway, here are my two migrations. And now it says which one is applied and which one is not applied.
That's cool.
Sorry, I'm like really hung up on like, why didn't this work? Let's try this.
So I can see myself doing something like, scripting something that parses this and knows which migrations are in a specific database, and then, going somewhere with that. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Oh, now it's working.
There it worked. I don't know what I did wrong, guys. You just try again 100 times and it works.
It just took the bits a little bit longer to reach the NuGet package manager console. So
there we go. Yeah, it was cached somewhere. I don't know.
So while we're transitioning, we did have another question come up, and that is, and I'm not sure if this is related to migration specifically, but what support do we have for stored procedures in EF5? Do we still have to add a blank migration?
You don't have to add a blank one. You can add it to an existing one. If I wanted to just add a stored procedure here, I can do migration builder.sql and then create procedure. I don't actually know how to create a procedure. I know SQL Server has some restrictions, and it has to be the first statement in a batch, and I actually think that's okay here. But if it's not, you can always just move it to the beginning. But yeah, so we still do not have any support for creating stored procedures. And we used to do that in EF6 for CUD operations, you could map an entity to stored procedures, and we would actually scaffold the stored procedures. We have not done that yet in EFCore.
So do you find the expectation or the common pattern is to generate the migration for the template and then kind of deal with it as a source project and make tweaks and modifications and kind of perfect it before it rolls out?
My hope is that everyone feels liberated to change these things. We call them scaffolded migrations for a reason. This is like MVC scaffolding. You wouldn't keep the default edit page. Like, you want to add tweaks to it. You want to add more validation. You want to make it pretty, right? This is sort of the bare bones. How can we get your schema to match your model? And it doesn't always do the right thing. For example, it may be dropping a column and adding a new one, when really what you wanted it to do was rename a column, and vice versa. It may be renaming a column and you actually wanted to just start a whole new column. So I hope that you would review these things. If not, I guess you'll still be able to store data, but it may get lost on the way.
I think this is a question that doesn't stop coming, actually. So a lot of people have this kind of, respect, like wrongly placed respect to these files, in the sense that EF generated this for me and I'm not supposed to touch generated code, right? There's this kind of thing. And we keep telling people, no, it's actually fine. This stuff we did for you, but now it's yours. This is your code now. It's part of your project.
And if you look closely, like, there's a reason why this little code behind file says it's auto-generated, but the main migration does not. Like, this is your code. You could change these things to internal classes. You could inherit from your own custom base type, whatever you want.
Which is good, because I think there is an impression that it should be just this wholly automated process, and you tweak some classes and run it. So there is a place in the development lifecycle to monitor and manage these, just like you would if you weren't using Entity Framework Core. If you don't just haphazardly make schema changes to a database. So it's good to call that out.
Yeah, and that we designed it this way specifically because we knew that however good migrations got, there would always be cases where you needed to do things that we couldn't figure out automatically, or we just couldn't handle automatically. So we talked about table rebuilds. I think Bryce is going to show table rebuilds on SQLite, hopefully later.
Yeah.
But on SQL Server, rebuilding a table to change the column order, for example, is very complex and error-prone process. And if we tried to automatically do that, we would get it wrong in a bunch of cases, and we get it wrong in ways that were very hard to fix. So it's always been the case. We scaffold the migration as a starting point, but you're expected to kind of review it and make sure it's doing what you want it to do, and make sure it's not doing what you don't want it to do and dropping some data that you don't want, and then add to it where you need to do specific things. That's kind of the only, I think, realistic design for migrations.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get to the demo where I do that later here. Sorry. So also, since this is PowerShell, this get migration thing is actually scriptable. So here's just a fun little query, like, get me all the migrations that have been applied and select the last one and give me its ID. And so now you can easily get what was the last migration applied to this database, initial create. So what's next? Let's look at the script that this thing generated. Migration. There's going to be a few new things you may notice here. This begin transaction statement is something that we haven't done in the past. Oh, whoops, actually I wanted to do this, sorry. I'll look at the one I just added instead of all of them. Okay, here we go. So begin transaction, this is something new we have not done in the scripts in the past, and it has kind of been a problem. So if you just would have taken the script and tried to execute it and it failed, it would not be in a good state. So our hope is that by adding these transaction begin and transaction commit sort of around each migration, that whenever something fails, your database should at least be between one of the migrations, and you won't be in this bad state that you have to recover from. Those are new. If you don't want them, there's a flag to remove them, but I hope everyone wants them, and I hope they work everywhere. If they don't, let us know.
So we didn't do this before because for two reasons really. We were a bit unsure that they would work everywhere, but we've done more investigation and we think they will now. And also because we wanted to leave it so that you could do your own transactions in the way you wanted when you were applying these scripts. So we've kind of made that easier for the common case now, but like Bryce says, you can remove these if it doesn't work, or if you need to put more things in a single transaction, or just generally change the way you're handling those transactions.
And I've seen some really cool solutions where people generate each migration in its own SQL script and then write like a bash shell around them to kind of see which ones are applied and then invoke them individually. So it's a pretty flexible system here. So
there's a comment here that I think is quite useful, saying that maybe we should put a comment in that says this is scaffolded and you're supposed to editing it. You're always closing the issue of saying it's auto-generated. Maybe we should put something in the actual scaffolded migration saying that. I think that's actually a pretty good idea.
Yeah, that's good advice. So here on SQL Server, you can see it's just a simple drop column statement. Just ignore all this. No, this is to drop any default constraints, which we don't always know if they're there or not. But ideally, this could just be a simple drop column on SQL Server. One more thing I wanted to look at in the script is this idempotent script. And an idempotent script is a script that you should be able to run on any database that has had these migrations. And no matter where they're at, it will bring them up to date. One interesting thing I want to call out here is this exec call. SQL Server has a really weird quirk where if you have an index filter, this thing right here is called an index filter, on a column that doesn't exist, but the table does exist, the parser gets really confused and it will throw an error even though this code would never run. And so we had a few people report that bug. And what we've done in EFCore 5 is enable providers to know whether it's generating an idempotent script or even a script at all. So it can do these sort of workarounds to make the script more robust. And I know there were a few fixes that went into Postgres for this too. Shai, do you want to talk to those?
Yeah, there's two issues that have been longstanding in Postgres, and the problem is, once again, just like you said, when you're doing an idempotent script and when you're doing a normal script, things have to look a little bit different. So, like one very painful kind of point, when people do data seeding in general, so that's a way of loading data into your database. Obviously, you're seeding and you're seeding ID values as well, right? So you're seeding blog with ID 1, blog with ID 2. But there's also a so-called identity, like a sequence-backed kind of ID, right, for that ID. And it's not aware of the fact that you use seeding in order to insert these two blogs. So it's still stuck at 1, although you've already inserted 2. That's kind of a thing where Postgres is maybe a little bit backwards compared to other databases, which will automatically update there's a good reason for this, but other databases will sometimes just, they know, okay, you just inserted it, so I'm going to update that sequence or identity or whatever. So this doesn't happen with Postgres, and it causes a lot of pain to people, right? Because you seed your blogs, and then the next time you try to insert something, boom, it explodes. So what we used to tell people, which is not necessarily a bad idea, it's like a trick, just use negative IDs, right? Just seed data with -1, -2. This way you never have this conflict. But sometimes that's not completely appropriate and people don't necessarily want to have negative IDs and so on. So what I did was something for 5.0, like one of the new features in RC1 is that there's like this kind of fancy thing where when you do seeding, that's detected. And I'm going to do this kind of magical snippet of SQL that's going to update the backing sequence of your IDs to the maximum of the column. And there's a bit more complexity there. And this kind of complex code looks different if you do it in an idempotent thing, which is, a whole different kind of environment, or just in a normal script. And finally, what Bryce did, just recently allowed me to fix this kind of bug, because now I can generate the correct SQL based on whether we're in an idempotent script or not. So that's super cool. And there's another one, which I'm not going to go into.
I think Firebird had a use case for it too, something around stored procedures. So it's really cool to see that our fix for SQL Server enabled other providers to fix similar bugs with the scripts.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, we've got our migration and we want to apply it to our database. Of course, there's update database for that. Well, I guess not, of course, if you're new to migrations. Wow, I can't type. I'm going to use auto-completion here. All right, update database. And let's say I'm ready to go to deploy this to production. A few things people have done in the past is like go inside your app settings and change the connection string and then run it. That's not ideal. They may have a production connection string here in production. and we can, and you used to be able to set, or I guess you still can set, sort of the ASP.NET or the generic host environment variable that's used to configure the environment. So it uses this production connection string instead. But if we go back and look at program here, we'll see there's this args that's being passed in. And when you run the application, it's passed in from the command line. One of the things we've done in EFCore 5 is to allow you to pass things into this arguments thing. And if you've ever used the iDesignTime DB context factory, there's also an args parameter there that was completely unused until now. We always had this in mind. So we finally implemented this. Update database -args. And you'll see these args are passed into the default host builder. And one of the things that lets you do is actually specify the environment production. And so this is a cool way that the tools can now flow things into your host builder and change, for example, which configuration it uses. This looks cool, but in reality, I really don't think you should have a production connection string that lets you alter the schema. That's a big red flag to me. So an even better alternative, which we've also added, is instead of passing in args, we have a -connection string, or I guess it's -connection parameter here. And you can actually just specify, your connection string here to go directly to production. So you'd like VPN in behind the firewall, where you have direct line of sight to your production database. You take down your website, put up the under construction, whatever your deployment process is like. And then you can point this directly at your production database, use all your credentials that have power to drop columns and alter the schema. And you don't have to change the app. You don't have to manually add this password somewhere or set an environment variable. You can do it all from the command line here. And let's see, what else did I want to say? Oh yeah, sorry, backing up, the args thing. We'll actually get to that in a minute. So let's apply, we've added a migration for SQL Server here, but we have two sets of migrations. And the SQLite migration still hasn't captured that we've removed this index post. So if we go back to program, what I'm doing here, in order to get the provider, there's something from configuration. Now I could go and change the default here to SQLite and then run the commands. But as we just learned, we can now flow things into the design time. And so this args is passed into the host builder, which uses the args as part of its configuration. So we can actually specify this provider now on the command line. So add migration, whatever I called it, remove person index. Doesn't have to be the same name, probably makes sense if it is. And then using this args thing, -- provider, SQLite. And so this is going to come in, the design time is going to create my host builder, provider is going to be SQLite this time, and so it's going to call use SQLite, and it's going to say, it's going to call use SQLite, and it's going to use the SQLite migrations assembly. So if I do this, and again, I forgot to change this. I'm glad I added that error because it gets me every time, and I don't want to add migrations to the wrong project. Try that again. All right, so same thing. We've added it to the SQLite. Oh, before I move on, I want to show what that looks like on .NET EF because it's not exactly the same. So on the command line, because it's kind of all the same idiomatic -- and short options and all that, we actually let you pass them without in a string. So if you notice on PowerShell, I had to put that thing in a string. If I can go back to it, I had to put all the arguments kind of in this string that got tacked on to the end of that got passed into your application. On .NET EF, I don't know if you've ever used .NET Run, but you kind of have to do .NET Run and then these hyphens and then the things you want to pass in to your application. What this -- thing is it's a special marker to say everything after this is another argument. And so there's options, which are these things that have hyphens, and then there's arguments, which is the migration name was an argument. And any arguments that the .NET EF command doesn't use. For example, the only argument you can specify for add migration is the migration name, and then everything after that is just kind of left over, and it doesn't know what to do with them, and so it passes them to the application. So that's all this hyphen is. It just says, don't treat this thing like a flag that .NET EF is supposed to parse. Pass it to my application, if that makes sense.
So a word on package manager versus the .NET EF commands. So one thing to note is that the .NET EF commands are perfectly usable in Visual Studio, as Bryce is showing, and the package manager commands, obviously, as we're seeing, work with EFCore. We've had some people think they only work with EF6. It's a different set of commands, but they do. And we try and be idiomatic to PowerShell or a command line parser in both cases, which is why the syntax is different for those two things, so that it works well in both cases. We would like to gather feedback. So if you have any feedback, post on GitHub or contact us in some other way on whether you use the package manager console or you prefer the command line. That's something that we're interested in finding out about.
I'd like to jump in with just 2 questions really quickly, if that's okay, Bryce.
Yeah, of course.
So the first one is, I've been using migrations for some years now. I'm wondering if we could ever have it added to the list of new items we get. So right-click from Visual Studio and add new item to the solution.
The Power Tools, EFCore Power Tools, I believe, have a little tool window that you can add, and it says, hey, you have pending migrations. Would you like to add a migration? So it's a very interactive experience. It's pretty cool. There are tools for that. I've thought about it in the past, but we haven't really done any Visual Studio extensibility on the team thus far. We've kind of let Eric handle that, and he's handled it great, in my opinion. So
awesome. And Eric is the maintainer of the Power Tools repo.
Eric EJ.
Another question, is there an official way to detect whether a design time tool is running the app? So for example, if you're scaffolding migrations. So yeah, go ahead.
The easiest way is to implement that iDesignTime interface. And it's literally just called that, like class xi design time. There it is, iDesignTime DB context factory of my DB context factory, or of my DB context, sorry. And if you implement this, so there's the args. If this entry point is ever called, the only thing that will call this thing is the tools. And so you can do whatever you want here to kind of new up your DB context with the knowledge that it's being done at design time for things related.
But I think the question here is more, if I'm understanding it rightly, if I'm like writing a provider, like Lawrence asked the question is, and I want to know, actually, this code is running in the context of an application that's doing a design time thing. Is there an easy way to do that without looking at the stack frame? Which I don't think there is, but I think it's a good idea.
No, we don't currently have that. The first thing we did in that direction was the scripting thing to let you know whether we're generating a script or not. All right. So let's go back to the migration, wherever it was. I think I just closed it. Whoops. So if you look at the SQL Server and the SQLite migration, I mean, you can barely tell I'm switching tabs here. They look identical because they're trying to perform the same operations. The data types are different. There's varchar down here in SQL Server and text here. This is nice because this is really like a DSL, a domain-specific language. You're able to declare like what you want to happen to the database. If you know anything about SQLite, you'll know it can actually support a drop column operation. But when you're writing the migration here, you don't have to know that. You can just say, hey, drop this column, and it will do it. So let's look at the script that gets generated for this.
Yeah, this is pretty huge.
Writer with SQLite. And we'll say we're at initial database, initial create. Forgot the names of things. All right, so we drop the index. Okay, that's expected. And then, oh, we're creating a table here. We're creating a temporary table. And this table is in the exact same shape as our original people table, except it has the email column missing. And so this is called a table rebuild. We create a new table with the schema that we want to happen, with all the constraints in place and everything. Like if we were adding any unique constraint, this new table would have that unique constraint. And then we copy all the data from the original table into this people table. We don't copy the email address because there's nowhere for it to go. And then we hit a point of no return. We have to commit the transaction, which is really unfortunate. The problem with that, sorry, getting tripped over. The problem with that is that if anything fails after this point, your database is going to be halfway through a migration. And so it's not a good place to be in. Some of the things we've tried to mitigate that problem is, again, we create all the constraints here. So if you're adding a unique constraint, but your column violates that unique constraint, it's going to throw before we hit this point of no return. And the other thing we do is we try and apply everything we can before we try and rebuild any tables. So all the table rebuilds will happen at the very end of a migration. So hopefully, if anything's going to go wrong with a migration, it's already happened by this point. The next thing we do here is this: we turn foreign keys off. I like to think of this as like a 3-year-old magic trick, right? Like, okay, now everyone close your eyes. You know, all the foreign keys look away, and then we quickly drop the table and then swap out this new table for the old table. And the reason the foreign keys have to look away is a lot of them would freak out over this statement right here. Like, they're going to say, wait, I have data pointing to that. You cannot drop that table. Or even worse, you drop that table. Oh, I'm going to cascade that delete and delete all of their posts. You know, but because we tell them, like, just ignore what's going on here, and then we swap it out. By the time they open their eyes again, there's a new person table that magically the email column is gone, but all the IDs are still there. All the foreign keys are still there. So all the integrity is preserved. They have no idea what hit them, but we were able to drop this column. And then
nice.
We begin the transaction. There is another step that could happen after here is the final step is to rebuild any indexes. Because we dropped the original table, we need to then rebuild any indexes you've had on that table. So this is the magic of a table rebuild. And if I can pull up, what is it, aka.ms/ not that one, EF docs, and then SQLite limitations. I'm just going to search for 5.0 so you can kind of get a visual. These are all the operations and when they were supported. So in 5.0, like, there are a ton of new operations that you can suddenly do in migrations. And finally, SQLite feels just like another database here. You can add check constraints, you can add primary keys, unique constraints, you can drop constraints, you can alter columns finally. And so really, for the first time, SQLite in EFCore is really robust with migrations, and we hope people get a lot of value out of this.
Yeah, this is pretty awesome. I'm stoked by this.
I have to say something about this. So I also think it's really super awesome, but there's one thing just that's important for people to understand. This is obviously not an easy operation, right? Like to create a table, move the data, drop, alter the name and all that. One very important point that people should understand is if you ever do something like this on a serious production, so we're in SQLite, I'm guessing that it's going to be a bit rare for people to run like a super big live database, and it's not really possible to do it concurrently. But in general, I'm using this as a point. If you do something like this on a live website, then it could go wrong, right? I mean, if there actually is something happening at the same time that you're moving these tables and so on, this could go really quite bad. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that migrations, although you can kind of, oh, sure, I'm going to, alter my schema when my application next kind of is deployed and goes live. And we have several servers and each one of them is maybe going up and doing all these schema changes. Be very careful about how you apply your migrations. That's basically the point I'm trying to make. And especially if you have multiple servers and, concurrency and all that kind of thing, this can be like a very, very tricky and difficult thing. It's not migration's fault. It's just the way it is in the world when you're doing data stuff.
And there's a reason we did this first on SQLite. Usually it's like one application has one database, and that database isn't shared, we hope. And so a lot of the risks are sort of mitigated by the fact that it is SQLite running, hopefully like on a small device or in isolation. And again, I talked about the mitigations about we try and do everything first so we don't like end up in a bad state here. It is risky, but hopefully for SQLite scenarios, the value far outweighs any of the risks here. And
Yeah,
totally agree.
kind of goes.
Also,
This kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. I think it's very unlikely that we'll do table rebuilds on SQL Server because the number of different ways that you can configure both the table, the columns, the relationships, the constraints, everything on SQL Server is so big that dropping it and creating those all correctly again on the new table is I think, going to be very error prone, even if we have enough metadata. SQLite, while the simplicity of it caused us to need to do this more, also allows us to do this because it has a pretty simple model with pretty simple types and constraints and facets and things. So I think this is it's an example where we can do it on SQLite where it's more needed, but we probably won't bring it to other providers.
One more limitation worth calling out here is that this table has to be part of your EF model. If this table is just some out-of-band table that you're trying to alter, it's we can't rebuild it because we don't know what it looks like, and so we won't even try.
But that would be pretty uncommon anyway.
Yeah, hopefully that's pretty uncommon. Put everything in your model.
Yeah.
All right, are we ready for the grand finale here? The one
Yes.
that I promised on Twitter. Actually,
I haven't seen this, and I'm like, I want to see it.
Actually, I have two, but we'll start with the big one and see if we have time for the other one.
Okay.
So in EFCore 5, one of the things we added was TPT mapping. And just to give a bit of background here, I want to run, I don't know if you guys are actually familiar with this command because I learned it was undocumented, even though we added it in EFCore 3. And this is CreateDB, sorry, no it's not, it's script. Wow, I cannot type. DB context. Script DB context. And what this does is it completely bypasses any migrations you have. It looks at your domain model and scaffolds a schema to match it. So this is kind of risky, but it's a really cool tool to sort of look at the database that your model is expecting. And you could take the script and run it against schema compare and in SQL Server data tools, and for those who are not using migrations. Just a handy little thing to have.
So this is essentially the equivalent of ensure created at
Yes.
runtime.
Yeah, dbcontext.database.ensure created. So if we look at this post table, we have this discriminator. We don't promote discrimination. This is basically the type. There's two types of posts. This discriminator will say, oh, it's either a post or it's one of those media posts we talk about. And if it's a media post, it might have these two additional columns, the URL and the media type. And
So
everything gets shoved into one table.
I'm derailing you, but I think the discriminator should not be nvarchar max, so we might want to file an issue on that.
I thought that too when I saw this too. Like, really?
Yeah.
Max? Wow. Long type names.
Yes.
So here the idea is whenever you do an insert or a query, you only have to look at one table. It's, you don't have to do a billion joins or anything. One of the downsides of TPH, some people call it single table inheritance, if you're more familiar with that pattern, is a lot of these columns are null. Because if it's not a medium post, all these columns are going to be null. And if you have a high hierarchy, you're going to have lots of null columns in your table, and some people don't like that. And so TPT, on the other hand, if we, let's say, go back to our model, the way we get TPT is we say, hey, this media post entity, I actually want to put it in its own table. Media posts. And then I'm going to run this script DB context again just to see if I did it right. It's hard using metadata. So here I have the post table, and I have there it is, the media post table. These two columns are here, and there's a foreign key over the ID pointing back to post. This foreign key is like an inheritance line in like a UML diagram, like this media post is actually this post. And if a post doesn't have a corresponding media post, then it's just a post. And so here you can see if I have a page that only displays sort of the media URLs and their types, like all it has to do is query one table. And so it really depends on how you query the data as to which mapping you want to use. I'm going to say I looked into it and I totally want TPT for this model of mine. So, or at least I think I do because it's the shiny new thing.
We're not advocating that people change their TPHs to TPT.
Yes.
So you should have your own justification for doing so.
In fact, in many cases, we've known it to be not necessarily optimal for performance, but I don't think we're going to get into this now.
There's that error again I keep getting. So glad I added it. All right, change my project. Can't believe I've done that every time. I have in my notes here say like, remember to change that.
Yeah.
All right, data loss. I do not want to lose any data here. I'm not expecting that. That should not be there. That's a big red flag here. Let's see, it goes through. Oh, it drops these columns. Well, wait a minute. I don't want to drop those yet. I need to move that data somewhere. And so I need someplace to put that data before we drop it. So I'm going to move these. Okay, there's the columns I want to add them to. I'm going to move this to after that. So as you can see, like, feel free to edit these migrations. They don't always do the right thing. You don't want to lose all your data just because you're changing the structure. So I'm going to move those around. And again, you don't have to think about whether this is going to be a table rebuild or not here. You just say, I want that to happen after this. So we're going to create the table here. And before we drop these columns, we want to move the data. Migration builder.sql. Literal string. And we're going to break out our T-SQL skills here. This is actually standard SQL. We're going to we're going to insert into this new table that we just created. And these new columns are listed right here. ID, media, URL, media type. We're going to insert into there, and we're going to insert by selecting these same columns, actually, because they didn't actually change names. I'm going to select these columns from the old table where they used to be, posts, but only where the discriminator is equal to the media post. So we create this new table to put these things in, and then we copy the data out of the old table, all the media posts. You can imagine if you had multiple types here, you'd need to insert into multiple tables. And then finally, we drop the tables here. Does that make sense? Any questions?
Yep. So what you're doing here is you're actually writing SQL and putting it inside your migration scripts to move the data from one table to the other. So I think we call that data motion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is an issue on the backlogs that you can vote for writing a more declarative API for this. It's not clear the value of that versus just writing SQL. The question we always get asked is, why can't I just use my C# code to do this? Well, because typically your C# code only represents your final model, not the previous models. And so writing against two models in C#, we did try and do that at one point. It was a hot mess. Anyway, it wasn't anything we shipped. So basically, you've got to have to do this at the database level with SQL. And we may be able to make that a little bit easier with some APIs, but essentially, it's not something that we think we can kind of abstract out easily to just doing it at the C# layer, unfortunately.
All right. I think that's all I had. I was actually going to change a one-to-many to a many-to-many, but that's your homework assignment.
Did you run the migrations and it
Yep.
worked and everything? Okay.
Succeeded.
I didn't see it. Can we share the screen again?
Bryce tells us it
Here,
works.
let me
There it
back
is.
up one. Let me just wipe out the database entirely. Go back to the like clean slate here. Let's do add migration. Oh, wait, update database. We'll do dash verbose for you.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Just
we're
wait
just
to see it happen.
Once again, trust Bryce.
Yeah.
Funny. Looks like we might have another bug. Oh well. It should show the sequel, I thought. Oh well. Maybe that code broke. I'll look into that. But yeah, trust me, everything works.
You're muted, Jeremy.
Just kidding. So that sounds good. So that's a good place to wrap, I think. And hopefully everyone is going out, downloading the release candidate bits, taking a look at a lot of new features and functionality. I think I'm always surprised. I've been tracking this for months now, and I still see new features demoed and just go. So look forward to you trying that out. Look forward to your feedback, and appreciate everyone joining us today. And we will be back here in 2 weeks. That is a wrap.